For more on the G20 summit and the free trade agreement between China and Australia, we're joined now from London by Kevin Rudd. Mr. Rudd served as the Prime Minister of Australia from 2007 to 2010 and again in 2013. Mr. Rudd, thanks for joining us. Let's start with that trade deal between Australia
Good to be with you from London.
And China. That deal, 10 years in the making. How significant is it for Australia?
I think it's a good deal both for China and a good deal for Australia. And that's what free trade agreements are if they're to be sustainable. The bottom line is this. We need to ensure that the interests of both countries are taken into account for the long term. And that means making sure that in Australia's case we have access not just to Chinese agricultural markets, but also to Chinese service industry markets, as well as the new service industry sectors such as tourism, finance and the rest. Also, from China's point of view, they wish to have greater access to our markets. We represent one of China's top 10 trading partners. The relationship's worth about $150 billion a year already bilaterally. So it's a big trading relationship. And that's before you go on to the new investment arrangements as well. Good for both of us, I think.
Well, let's talk about those new investment arrangements. Is there anything like a cap on Chinese investment in Australia right now?
Well, the arrangements in Australia under the Foreign Investment Review Board Act, which goes back 20 or 30 years, applies to all foreign investments above a certain dollar threshold, whatever country they come from, unless, of course, they are covered by separate free trade agreements with other countries. The only one of consequence that we have in that area is with the United States, which we signed about 10 years ago. So there's no current discrimination against China. In fact, the limitations which currently exist apply to all other countries. With this new agreement, we have China lifted to the same threshold as the United States, which means that for investments into Australia, anywhere under about 1 billion Australian dollars, then those can proceed directly without Foreign Investment Review Board approval. A couple of exceptions, one in terms of agricultural land, and the second in terms of inbound investments to Australia from China, from state-owned enterprises where our current universal policy remains, not just against China, but against all countries which operate SOEs.
Right, let's move on to the G20 summit, which took place in Brisbane. You were one of the co-founders of the G20 when it acted to stem the 2009 economic crisis from spiraling totally out of control into a global depression. We now have a situation where Japan is in recession. David Cameron, the British Prime Minister, is warning that Europe could be entering a recession as well. How concerned are you about these latest developments?
Significantly concerned. I mean, the truth is, since the global financial crisis first hit back in 2008, the global economy has not fully recovered. We've only in recent times had a growth recovery in the United States. Growth is still robust in China, but a little slower than it was. The figures from Japan you've just mentioned, which is, I think, deeply disturbing. And then, of course, you have Europe, where we don't have any effective recovery from the crisis. And so across the global economy, the significance of the G20, I think, is in two particular areas. One, a commitment from all the major economies, all 20 of them, to lift their growth targets over the next 5 years by 2 percentage points in aggregate over those 5 years. And secondly, a new growth engine in terms of global infrastructure investment through a new global infrastructure initiative, and that's anchored in a new global infrastructure hub to be located in Sydney. So it's not just a target, it's also specific ways which we can actually lift global activity in order to fill the global demand gap.
Right, at that summit, there was also something of a focus on climate change. As Prime Minister of Australia, you ratified the Kyoto Protocol, legislated for a 20% mandatory renewable energy target. But Australia has since repealed the carbon tax. What's your response to that?
Well, Australian domestic politics is currently in the hands of Prime Minister Abbott and the leader of the opposition, Mr Shorten. And I don't intend to provide a rolling commentary on their domestic political debates. My own personal credentials on climate change are well known to all. I led the Australian delegation to the 2009 Copenhagen summit, which is one of the toughest that we've ever had, but probably a process we had to go through in order to produce incremental advances on the climate change agenda in the 5 years since then. leading to, I think, significant breakthroughs between China under Xi Jinping and the United States under President Obama during their recent bilaterals in Beijing at the time of the APEC meeting. The new commitment to carbon caps or carbon peaks by these two economies, I believe, is highly significant because they are the world's two largest emitters. And on top of that, they provide, at a political level, momentum heading towards the critical Paris Conference of the Parties, due to be held 12 months' time. And so I think we're starting to head in the right direction. The big change factor has been China itself. And of course, all countries will have to lift their game.
One other issue that dominated the G20 summit, the focus on Russia and the Ukraine. There were coordinated statements coming from the United States and its allies, including Australia. Was there too much of a focus on that?
Well, the core question is this. The rationale for the G20, and having been a co-founder of the G20 myself, was to be the premium forum for global financial and economic management. Therefore, it was critical that we keep our eye on the ball, firstly, on the completion of the financial regulatory reform agenda initiated in Washington some 6 years ago, all necessary in order to prevent a return of the financial crisis or reduce the probability of it that we had to confront back in 2008 because the consequences for all of us were devastating. And secondly, the second big agenda of the G20 was to produce stable, strong, balanced growth for the long term. And that's where we've had a real challenge, and hence our earlier conversation, this interview, about re-energising domestic and global economic growth across the world, because that's critical for jobs. It's as critical for jobs in Sichuan in China as it is for San Francisco in America, as it is for Sydney in Australia. That's the core of the agenda. Obviously, there are going to be foreign policy discussions at the side of these meetings as well. And of course, the positions concerning Russia and the positions concerning the Ukraine are well known and well documented on the international agenda.
Right. One of the other foreign policy discussions that took place was that three-way meeting that took place between among Prime Minister Tony Abbott, the US President Barack Obama, as well as Shinzo Abe, the Japanese Prime Minister, in which they recommitted themselves to deepening military ties between these three countries, military cooperation. Was there a bigger message there for China in those talks?
Well, I have a simple view about the future of security cooperation in the East Asian region, more broadly into the long term. Xi Jinping has been talking in recent times about a new Asian security concept. We in East Asia already come together as the East Asian Summit, most recently in Myanmar and its capital, Naypyidaw. And it has got an agenda which deals with wider regional security questions. And beyond that, again, I think there is an emerging interest on the part of many countries to begin to devise the principles of common security across East Asia, rather than security arrangements which are permanently targeted against one another. So therefore, not being privy to any of the bilateral or trilateral discussions which have occurred most recently in Brisbane in Australia, my overall message to regional leaders ever since I was Prime Minister has been, how do we manage to evolve a concept of common security and in the long term develop a concept of an Asia-Pacific community which reduces the probability of conflict between China and the United States and its allies in the future, rather than simply anticipates the inevitability of such a conflict. That's where I come from, and that will continue to be my contribution to this global and important regional debate.
Kevin Rudd, thanks for joining us, sir.